The goal has been the same, and that's really to approach the 2020 election in our capacity as educators with excitement for the opportunities that the election provides for us as educators to engage in really important and meaningful and controversial conversations with our students. And some of these conversations are hard, they're challenging, but that's in part precisely why we need to be having them. And so the focus for this morning is, how do we do that with our students? How do we do it safely, effectively, fairly, justly? That's what Dr. McAvoy and the team from Street Law are here to help us think about. And so our time is limited, and I want to get right to Jen and her team, but I just want to give them a big welcome and a big thank you for making this come together. I know that it was not the original plan to do it this way, but I really appreciate their flexibility and their willingness to join us this morning. So I'm really looking forward to it. So Jen, take it away.
Thank you, Clay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Wheeler. I work with Street Law. I'm going to introduce you to my team in just a moment. But before we do that, we're going to do some sort of setup to make sure that you know how to participate and kind of what to expect with our work today. So thank you for joining us for today's session on dilemmas in facilitating political conversations with students. Before we begin, I want to make sure that you have the handouts for today's session. Those were handouts that were sent via email, that Clay sent via email, I think last Friday maybe. If you don't have those handouts pulled up, someone from Street Law is going to add the files to the chat here in a moment, so you'll be able to pull them up out of the chat if Ben or Erica might be able to do that. You'll see them. There they are. Thanks, Ben. See them there now, just in case. So you will need those handouts, and in fact, those handouts will be especially important when you go into breakout rooms, because it's really hard for us to communicate to you via breakout room. And so make sure that you have those handouts, especially for when you get there. So here's our agenda for our time together today. We're going to start with just overview, introductions, that kind of thing. Then we'll jump into a short conversation about why engage in political conversations, where we'll weigh a bit about risks, dilemmas, challenges with political conversation, but also the benefits, why we should be doing this. Then we're going to turn it over to Dr. McAvoy, who will give a talk about politics and professional judgments. And then we will have some time in longer breakout groups to talk about that case study that you took a look at, first as a small group and then reflect as a larger group. Then we'll have time for Q&A with Dr. McAvoy, where you can ask questions related to kind of any of the work that she's done, but particularly around her talk earlier and connected to the conversations that you had around the case study. And then finally, we'll kind of wrap up with some closing and potential next steps. So Clay says that you're pretty familiar with Zoom. These are just a couple reminders about different ways to participate in this session. As much as we can, we've tried to make this kind of an active learning session. So you already heard me talk about breakout rooms. We're going to use a polling software called Poll Everywhere that does a little bit more than polling, but allows us to have some interactive participation. So at times we'll ask you to use the chat box. So make sure that you are aware of where the chat box is. If you're not, you can maximize your screen, your Zoom screen, and you'll find the chat box on the black bar at the bottom. Using that for two purposes. Number one, if we ask for chat responses, to type them in there, but also if you're having a tech issue, you might notice that some people, Jasmine, Ben, and Erica from Street Law, all have tech support in their names, and so you can chat directly to them if you're having a problem with any sort of tech issue, and they can try to help. The other time when you may need to use these Zoom features is to unmute and respond. At times we'll ask for people to share some of their responses just because they have something more in depth than what they'd like to put into a chat box. So we'll call out when we'd love to hear your voices, and hopefully we can help you to unmute yourself and share with us. And then finally, when it comes to your video, we love seeing faces, but we also realize that there are lots of reasons maybe that you don't want to show you to have your video on. And so please make the choice that's best for you. In your breakout groups, you may want to even turn them on, particularly for your breakout groups, because you'll be in small groups of 4 to 6 at that time. We are going to use a feature, like I mentioned earlier, called Poll Everywhere. And if you want to try this now, it'll let you kind of gain access so that when we bring up the first poll, it will immediately pop up for you. The preferred method here for Poll Everywhere is via an internet browser. And you can do that in one of 2 ways. You can pull up an internet browser on your phone if you have a smartphone, or you can pull up an internet browser on your computer if you make the Zoom window smaller. Pull up another internet browser, and it looks like Ben has dropped the link for Poll Everywhere, so you don't even need to type it in yourself. You can just grab that link if you want to, and if you click that link, it's going to give you access to Poll Everywhere, so that when we bring up our first poll, you'll be ready for it. Just don't close it, basically. So make sure that you have it open, and once that first poll pops up, you'll see it. You can also access this via text message. It's a little bit more challenging and not all of the features work, but if that's your only method, then the way to access it via text message is to type 22333 in the phone number place, and then enter Street Law Inc. 431 in the message. When you hit send, it will connect you, and then once we have the questions pop up, it will let you know what those questions are. So if you're not connected now, or if you're having some tech anxiety about this, don't worry. We'll give you some alternate methods to respond to these questions as well. Here are the Street Law folks that are on board today. You're mostly going to hear from myself and Kathy Ruffing. Kathy, if you want to take yourself off mute real quick to say hi.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kathy Ruffing.
Thanks, Kathy. So Kathy is our Senior Director of Teacher Professional Development and Curriculum. And then we also have 3 Street Law staff with us on board today who are going to be dropping into breakout rooms, supporting you in kind of different ways. That's Jasmine, Erica, and Ben. And those 3, if you guys want to, you can give a little wave. You can type hi into the chat box. We also have with us, we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Paula McAvoy. Paula McAvoy earned her PhD in Philosophy of Education in 2010 at UW-Madison's Department of Educational Policy Studies. Since then, she's worked as an assistant professor at Illinois State, an associate program officer at the Spencer Foundation, and as the director of the Center for Ethics and Education at UW-Madison. Prior to this, she taught high school social studies for 10 years at the Foothill Middle College program in Los Altos, California. Her research focuses on philosophical and empirical questions concerning the relationship between schools and democratic society, and she is now a professor at NC State University. Paul, if you want to take yourself off mute to say hi as well.
Good morning, everyone.
So we are Street Law. Street Law has almost 50 years of experience developing programs and curricula that teach young people about the law, how to use it as a positive force in their lives. We do work in 5 areas: teacher professional development, legal community partnerships, legal life skills, global law and democracy programs, and curricula and teaching materials. If you want to know more about Street Law, that's our website, and we'll talk more about some Street Law resources that may be relevant based on today's work later on in the session. And finally, before we actually begin to do the real work, here are our objectives for today. So our goals are that you'll be able to kind of walk away from this knowing some reasons to engage in political conversation, as well as some of the risks and dilemmas, and kind of be prepared to address some of those risks and dilemmas. Weigh strategies for facilitating political conversations, and of course, support students as they engage in these conversations. So we're going to start with examining the benefits, dilemmas, and drawbacks of engaging in political conversation with young people. And there's 2 kind of terms that we want to lay some groundwork for that are going to come up in today's session a lot, just so that we make sure that we're all kind of in the same place about what these terms mean. So when we say political, we mean that students are engaged in discussions about questions that ask, how should we live together? As Dr. McAvoy wrote in the article that you read ahead of today's session. Those topics might include things like gun rights and gun control, wage policies like about the minimum wage, immigration policies like what the case study covered, and other topics that are often in the news related to public policy. And by conversations, we mean informal or formal school discussions that you would be a part of based on your role in school. So that could mean that you develop lessons to have students formally discuss these topics in your classroom, or it could also be more informal. Some of us might not be in a classroom where we would conduct political discussions because of what we teach, and some of us might not be in classrooms at all. But political conversations, as we know, don't stop or start at a classroom door. And so we want the term conversation to be inclusive of conversations with students about political issues that could happen in the dorm, that could happen on the bus on the way to a basketball game, that could carry over into a math class. And at some points in the seminar, we are going to talk specifically about formal, high-quality discussions. Generally, when we talk about those types of formal discussions, we think about high-quality discussions as activities that are structured and planned in advance, that have a goal in mind to help deepen students' understanding of a topic and improve their discussion skills. And in these high-quality discussions, students mostly talk to one another rather than to the teacher, and the teacher kind of regulates discussion, as Dr. McAvoy says. Students listen to one another, they evaluate claims and evidence, and they ask questions and disagree respectfully. So those are kind of the terms that we mean when we say facilitating political discussions. We wanted the kind of conversations piece of things to be inclusive of all of the people that are on this, this meeting today. Oh, so it looks like some of us have gotten started. I was a little bit surprised to see that. I guess this poll is active right now already. Great. If you have not yet seen this poll, here is the way that this poll everywhere feature works. So this is a word cloud. And one quick note before some of you jump into this is it works best if you enter one word. Which is probably why the word students right now is so large, because we may have written like a sentence or a phrase. So if you can, as you enter in your responses, try to kind of narrow your feelings for this. When I think about having political conversations with young people, I feel one word if possible. If you're just getting to this and you need a little bit of help with how to access this, it looks like Ben Marks has reminded everyone of the link to this word cloud. So click on that link and you can then type in your response. That's great to see. Excited, so big. The words that are bigger mean more and more people are entering those words. So I'm going to give a little bit of time for more folks to jump in with their thoughts. If you are unable to figure out poll everywhere, or you're having some sort of tech issue, one option is to reach out to one of the Street Law Tech folks, or you can just type your response into the chat box too. Oh, hashtag fired up. That's a good one. So as we can see, some of these responses are kind of setting up our conversation for today, that there's positive kind of excitement about that, but that's not without some feelings of anxiety, some feelings of stress, caution. Some of the smaller words are still things that your colleagues feel that they're just maybe alone in putting that particular word in the cloud. I think Marie says concerned in the chat box. Let's give about 30 more seconds for this. Okay. So thank you for your responses here. We've got excited, nervous, anxious, cautious as kind of the big words. I'm going to flip us to the next slide where we're going to get to kind of expand on these feelings a little bit more. It's always hard to leave that slide. So to expand more on these feelings, here's kind of the rest of that phrase. When I think about having political conversations with young people, I feel blank because blank. So this is the time when the chat box is going to be super useful to us. If you can continue that statement, so tell us what you feel and why you feel it in the chat box, that'll let us know kind of where you're coming from with those feelings of excitement or anxiety or concern, or that it's going to be transformative, or that you're fired up. Why are you feeling that way? So take a moment to type up your response in the chat box. And if we might have, thanks Kathy for that reminder, don't close poll everywhere. We'll be using it again later. If you did close it, it's not the end of the world. You can focus on this right now. So take a moment to type your responses to this question in the chat box, and we'll get one or two people, if they have something they'd like to share aloud. You can write, I'll share aloud in the chat box, and we can ask you to unmute yourself. Thanks, April, for adding your thoughts. Yeah, April, you're nervous and angry about the state of things reminds us that we don't, we can't divorce our own feelings from this. Sometimes it can be really challenging. Wow, we've got a lot of responses now. Does anyone want to come off mute to share a response aloud? Yeah, responsibility, different perspectives. Thanks, Corey and Aaron.
I think what Donald said about feeling like you can't keep up with everything that's out there is really a real anxiety, because you want to feel like when you have these conversations that you are aware of all the potential data out there, all the potential viewpoints on things. But with the 24/7 news cycle, you can't know everything about any topic. So I think that's a real concern. That's a good one.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for highlighting that. All right, so we're going to move on to the next part of this, which is to think about to get ourselves into some short breakout groups, not too long, but maybe about 5 minutes, to actually have some conversations together about why to engage in political conversation. So if you pulled up those notes, those handouts from earlier, on page 2, you're going to see a chart that looks kind of like this, that has a setup of benefits and then challenges and dilemmas. And so we're going to put you into breakout groups. Thanks, Ben, for putting those up again. Make sure that you have those up. It's hard for us to communicate once you're in the breakout groups. But once you get into your breakout groups, you don't need to take notes on this. It's just kind of there as guidance. Have a conversation. What are some benefits? Why would you want to do it? But what are also some challenges that might come up? So Jasmine, if we're ready, let's do breakout groups until about 10:27. So that gives us 5 minutes in these breakout groups. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Sorry that your breakout rooms weren't quite as long as we would have liked for them to be, but we are going to have a much longer breakout room later, so that is a good thing. So hopefully your conversation about some of the benefits may have met, or your conversation about the benefits may have mentioned some of these things. These points are come from one of Paula's books that she wrote with Dr. Diana Hess, called The Political Classroom. Evidence shows that students in classrooms with high quality discussion, so we talked a little bit about high quality discussion earlier and what that means. Here's what some of that evidence says, that students, when they get a chance to do this and do this well, are more tolerant of a variety of political perspectives and views, and are more willing to consider other points of view. That students are more interested in these issues and understand the nuances of tough topics. That students intend to vote, which is obviously so important to the functioning of our democracy. That students follow the news. Think about a time when a student got really interested in a topic and kept on learning about it. A high quality discussion of these topics can do that for students. And students are more comfortable with disagreement. So think about what happens when we aren't comfortable with disagreement. What does it look like for our friendships when we're not comfortable with disagreement? What does it look like for our relationships? What does it look like for our interactions with others when we're not comfortable with disagreement? What does that mean for the concept of public good when we're not comfortable with disagreement? And what does it mean for our democracy? And the last thing I'd like to point out on the slide is just, if not in school and with you, then where? We don't have a lot of examples of good, high quality discussion in the public sphere. And Paula brought that up in the article that you read about kind of the political campaign talk versus this type of discussion. So hopefully those were some of the benefits that you were talking about. If you talk about some additional benefits, of which there are many, and you want to add any of those benefits into the chat to kind of highlight additional things that you were talking about with your groups, go ahead and add any additional benefits. We're going to move the slide next to talk a little bit about some of the drawbacks that you may have talked about as well. So instead of, like the last slide, kind of sharing the research, we'd just love to hear from you about what some of the challenges or dilemmas of political conversations might be. So if you get a moment, please type into the chat box something that you thought about, your group talked about when it comes to challenges of having political conversations with students. And if one or two people want to also respond aloud, then we can make that happen during this time. Yeah, thank you. So someone says, not much real listening going on these days. It can be tough to figure out what real listening is and to make it happen. A fixed mindset. Someone saying something really offensive, or emotional reactions to things. Peer pressure. Yeah, I'd love, either the person who wrote peer pressure or someone else wants to talk more about what you mean by that. I'd love to hear what you mean by peer pressure. Tact for their belief.
I wrote peer pressure because sometimes you just, because for example, in Berkshire school, there's probably a majority of the people in one with one mindset, and the other one, and there's fewer. So the fewer people might feel pressure, they cannot voice their voice. Or in our group, I specifically say is in US, it's so just two type of group that you can gravitate. But I am in the third or fourth group, and I really don't feel like I have a voice. So I feel peer pressured that I'm not comfortable to talk about it.
Yeah, that's great. I think that you've definitely connected with some of the points that I believe Paula's going to make in her talk next. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Conflicting views, anger. Great. So, I mean, obviously there's lots to be concerned about. There's lots of dilemmas that we have with having these conversations with students. There's dilemmas that we have and challenges that we have with having these conversations in our own lives, much less with students. So now I want to turn it over to Paula to talk a little bit more. Or actually, I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Kathy to introduce Paula to talk more about this.
Okay, yeah, and we already heard about Paula's credentials, so we won't go through that again, but we just wanted to say that in this part
of the seminar. We're going to hear from Dr. Paula McAvoy and about her research that deals with facilitating political conversations with students and the dilemmas that teachers in school are facing when they do that important work. So we'll turn it over to Paula.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm going to share a different screen with you all, so 1 second. Thank you for the invitation to join you all today. I should say that as one way of introduction, I often am invited to work with social studies teachers in middle and high schools about the how to have political discussions in the classroom. And the purpose of this workshop, though, today is a little different than the how, but sort of we're looking at the why and then how to work through the ethical dilemmas that come up when we, either in casual conversations or in intentional classroom moments, engage in political discussion. And so I'm gonna give in the next 15 minutes here a little bit of background about political polarization. We all know it's happening, but a little bit about why it's happening, I think, is kind of helpful for us to frame the way we're thinking about this, the dilemmas we face, and then talk a little bit about a project that I'm working on right now that's more directly about ethical dilemmas that teachers face, and then try to frame how to think about ethical dilemmas, because then as a way to set up for the case study discussion that you're about to have. So first, the idea of political polarization, we often think of it, the most common way to think about it is the ideological distance between the major political parties in the United States. And so we feel like the Democrats are left and moving further left, and the Republicans are right and moving further right. And then it creates this loss of the place in the middle where compromise can happen, or we actually do the addressing of the common problems that we're facing in society. And it's true that the United States right now, since about there's different ways to mark this, but definitely from the 1980s and actually before in the 1960s is where political scientists start marking the trend towards political polarization that we're experiencing today. And my little side hobbies is to read political science literature on why political polarization is happening. And I can do whole hour-long workshops about this, but I'm just going to hit some 4 key highlights for you as a way to get going. So first, political polarization has been driven by the ideological sorting of the 2 major parties. And so in the 1960s, which was where our story will begin, the Republicans and Democrats were both very centrist parties, and they were ideologically mixed parties. So in the 1950s, if someone said they were a Democrat, that didn't tell you much about their ideological orientation. So there's a history to why people were Democrats, there's a history of why people were Republicans. But beginning in 1965, well, that's one key marker of the story of political polarization. With the Voting Rights Act, the parties begin to ideologically sort. And part of that sorting has to do with the history of white supremacy in the United States. So when the Democratic Party came down on the side of civil rights and started using federal troops to force desegregation, for example, and in 1965, with the Voting Rights Act, which said that the federal government will regulate voting behavior in the southern states, this begins the ideological sorting. So the Democratic Party gets seen as a party of the left, and the Republican Party's response was to respond with Nixon's Southern strategy, which was to lure the people moving away from the Democratic Party, often known as the Dixiecrats, who were the white supremacists of the South, into the Republican Party. And this begins then, the Republicans become seen as sort of the conservative, law and order, small state, small federal government, and the Democrats look to be interventionist, left-leaning party. And this continues into the 1980s, the 1970s is when this sorting is playing out. And then in the 1980s, economic inequality starts rising dramatically. And so the political scientists who research polarization mark 2 big periods of polarization one earlier and prior to World War I and the one we're in now. Both of those periods had dramatic, the political polarization and economic inequality were rising side by side together. So these are, they describe this as two forces that are dancing with each other. So as money gets into the hands of the wealthy, they start controlling the agenda, which makes it much harder to address the issues of economic inequality and our social problems. So this is important to keep in mind, that this is that political polarization is not just bad behavior by our elected officials, but that there are social forces that sort of are wrapping around it and exacerbating it. And then finally, in both major areas of political polarization, you had increases in immigration and foreign-born citizens. And so also in the 1960s, our immigration policy changes. There are more people immigrating to the United States. And what tends to happen is that the lower, like working class, begins to feel economically insecure because of the economic inequality, and this drives animosity against immigrants, because it's seen as that the immigrants the working class tend to view the immigrants as a threat, and not see maybe the social forces happening sort of at the top, upper echelons of society. So those are 4 key reasons why political polarization is happening. And those are important, I think, for kids to understand, for us to understand as we enter the political sphere. But the other major way, or another issue that's coming up related to polarization, which is what you are talking about in your classes and your responses, or what's coming up when you say you're anxious and worried, is feelings of affective polarization. And so these affective polarization refers to how we feel towards one another because of the polarization that's happening towards us, or around us. So if we look at polling, this is by Pew Research Center, of surveying Democrats and Republicans about how, just regular old citizens, how you feel about one another. So if you identify as a Democrat or identify as a Republican, the percentage of Democrats and Republicans who have a very unfavorable view of the other party has been increasing dramatically as our as the larger political system polarizes. We begin to feel more and more animosity towards one another, and we dislike each other at about the same rate. So Democrats and Republicans sort of equally find each other. In even more recent polling in 2019. That they're distrustful. Each side thinks the other's distrustful, dishonest, lying. So there's this whole slew of attitudes that have risen along with our political polarization. And in fact, this becomes a problem if you want to have a democracy, because we're also seeing that at about equal rates, Republicans and Democrats see each other as not just disagreeing, but actually dangerous to each other, so that we think that the other party is a threat to the country's well-being. And when you have this feeling, you feel this in the election season, right? That if my side doesn't win, then the whole world's going, we're ruined forever. And so, this is a complicated phenomenon, but just to wanted to narrow in for you that we have an issue in the United States of deep, deep distrust of one another. And when we deeply distrust one another, it becomes very difficult to do the very basic things required for democracy, which is to try to address our problems in a way that everyone can feel okay with. Okay, so take that backdrop and enter the classroom, and you have kids that have been raised in this climate, who have parents who have these feelings, and now they're coming into class and they're trying to figure out our political system. They're trying to figure out how they want to be within the democratic system or within our society. And this creates the anxiety and worry that a lot of you mentioned at the very beginning. Okay, so hold on to that story. And then I wanted to pivot a little bit to talk about, so then this raises for us as teachers a whole set of professional judgments that come with bringing politics into the classroom. And what I'm about to talk about now is a project under development of a book called Just Teacher, Taking the Ethical Long View in the Profession of Teaching that I'm working with with a colleague, Lauren Gaddy. And Lauren and I have surveyed teachers from around the country, K-12 in all sorts of settings, and done a subset of interviews and asked them, what are the ethical dilemmas that you face in the classroom? And these are not just social studies teachers, these are all sorts of teachers. And just very briefly, what they identified at this very open-ended questions were about half the issues were related to student behavior or student well-being. Well-being here being, students that are homeless or feel anxiety or suffering from depression, and or just kind of general misbehavior in the classroom. A lot of talk about grading, feeling pressure to grade in a certain way, parents intervening with grading, administrators interfering with grading. Then controversial issues was the third most common topic, which was political things arising intentionally or unintentionally in the classroom. And then a couple of categories of sort of professional relationships with your colleagues, and questions around who controls what I teach in the classroom. But that's just a little bit of background. And so what we're going to ask you today to do is to talk about a case. It's not from that study. This is a case that the street law team developed. But we're looking at ethical questions, and an ethical question is what should I do question. So these are those moments when you teach and stop and think, what should I do with this? But in the book I was just talking about, we're developing what we look at the data about the dilemmas that teachers face overall. We see that dilemmas often arise because teachers are sitting within a nest of sort of 5 or 4 responsibilities that we talk about. So a teacher enters the classroom with a conception of good teaching, the curriculum that you want to teach, how you think it should be taught, the sort of relationships you want to cultivate in the classroom. But the teacher is also responsible to education policy, which could be the department level policy, it could be the school level policy, it could be state policy, etc. Teachers are also responsible and attentive to the interests and needs of parents. They have their own view about what good teaching is, they have view of student needs. And then the teacher is responsible to the well-being of children. So both groups of children and individual children, and those two things can come into conflict with one another. So dilemmas are those moments that arise when one of these responsibilities comes into conflict with another one. And so a dilemma in short, and we're going to ask you to identify the dilemma that in the case you're going to read about, but a dilemma is the sort of mechanics of it are as follows. I value something X, and that thing is a good thing, and I value some other good thing Y. And a dilemma emerges because if I do one thing in this moment, I undermine X, and if I do another thing, I undermine Y. So now I'm caught. I seem to have to give up something that I value right now. So this could look like in the science classroom, I value teaching science, I value good science education, or have a view of good science, and I value the cultural differences that students bring to school. And so the student with deeply religious beliefs, for example, might feel some tension with the science curriculum. And now the science teacher may feel a caught between, do I accommodate this student, or how do I make sure this student feels okay in the classroom? How do I and still hold on to what I think a good science curriculum is? So that would be one example of a dilemma that could emerge between two good competing values. All right, so here's how we're sitting within the classroom. And what's happening with political polarization and many of the issues in society is that overlaying our decisions and behaviors in the classroom, polarization is seeping into the school, both political polarization and affective polarization. So kids bring this into the classroom with them. And then we're also dealing with injustices that exist inside and outside the school, racism, poverty, sexism. And so any one dilemma may be a conflict between a teacher and student, but it may also have some layers of these sort of attitudes and injustices coming into the classroom. And so they further complicate the dilemma that the teacher is facing. Okay, so I'm gonna pause there. And you're gonna see in the case that you're gonna read in your group, dilemmas coming in, values coming in conflict with one another. So one of the first questions of the case is to say, what is this a dilemma about? And so oftentimes when we face dilemmas, it's hard to have time in the moment to think about what should I do. So right now, the point of this discussion is to let you sort of pause for a second and sort of carefully think through the dilemma as a way to get some clarity about these issues. So I'm gonna stop there, Jen, and hand off. And we can, after your discussion, have some more Q&A, I believe.
Great, thank you, Dr. McAvoy. We're now going to take what we just heard from Dr. McAvoy and the articles that we read, and we're going to apply what we've discussed in the first half of the seminar to a case study about political conversations that we've developed. So we're going to do that in breakout rooms. And that's going to help us have a deeper and more practical conversation about these political discussions in schools. And we're going to use the case study that we sent you earlier and ask you to pre-read. If you didn't, there'll be time to review it. So in a few moments, you're going to be back in the same breakout rooms you were in before, so 4 to 5 people. And you and your colleagues are going to start by reviewing the case study, making sure you understand what you read, and then discussing it according to the protocol that follows the case study that includes 4 steps for your group. You can take your time and explore lots of different avenues. You're going to have a lot of time in these groups, unlike the last time. And then once you feel like you have exhausted your discussion of part 1, move on to case study part 2 and discuss it according to the protocol that follows it. As you discuss, you might want to take notes and jot down questions that you have along the way, because we will follow with a Q&A session with Dr. McAvoy. To support your conversations, you have both parts of the case study and the discussion protocols, and those are on pages 3 to 5 of the documents that we sent. So hopefully someone from Street Law will drop that link again in the chat box, just in case you need to pull those up again. You might want to make sure all of those documents are up before you head into the breakout rooms, and it might be helpful to have someone share those documents as well. While you work with your colleagues, some facilitator from Street Law will drop into your group. We're just there to make sure that you're on track, take any questions you have about what you're supposed to be doing. If you have a pressing question before one of us is able to get to your group, you can leave your breakout group and come back to the main room, where there'll be a facilitator who can help you with any questions you might have. Before we head off to the breakout rooms, are there any questions? If there are, you could drop them in chat or raise your hand, take yourself off mute. Any questions before we go? We're going to be in these breakout rooms until 11:20, so that gives you a little more than 25 minutes. So if there are no questions, and seeing none, we will see you back at 11:20.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you for such engaged and interesting conversations in your breakout rooms. It seems like there's a lot of connections that you've made to what's been happening in the school, and then also connections being made to kind of thinking forward, thinking to the future. So we're gonna do a little bit of kind of debrief of some of these whole group conversations. I'm sorry, the small group conversations as a whole group, so that we can get some insight into what different groups talked about, different thoughts about what decisions they said Mr. Scott and Ms. Lopez should make. So we're gonna start with just thinking about the dilemma, and I really appreciated the couple groups that I visited. Some of them were trying to think about the dilemma kind of in the terms that Paula set up, that I value X and I value Y. If I do X, then Y might suffer and vice versa. And so if we're thinking about Mr. Scott's situation to start, what would you say his dilemma is in this case? And it doesn't need to be framed in the way that Paula set up, Dr. McAvoy set up for us. You know, if you can do that, that's awesome. But if you can type your response into the chat box, what is Mr. Scott's dilemma? Or if we've got somebody who'd like to share aloud what your group said the dilemma was from his situation.
At the risk of putting someone on the spot, Kevin in group 5, Soha maybe last name. I thought that your phrasing of one of the dilemmas, I think one of the things I learned from going to so many groups is there are multiple dilemmas that people were able to name. But Kevin, would you be willing to voice yours?
Yeah, I think we were talking about the dilemma of whether to protect or teach how to advocate. And it was a great conversation. I feel like the conversations end too quickly. But that's the one that we were talking about most recently is Rashid brought up a really good point about the opportunity for Melanie to learn how to advocate, but we also wanted to support her and her position in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I see some coming up in the chat box, valuing student discussion, but also valuing the well-being and safety of students. That I think is one of those key dilemmas here. Respecting both sides and facilitating a productive conversation, that we want these students to feel like they both have a voice in this conversation. So we don't want to shut that down. Right, yeah, Anita brings that up too. So then let's move into what you think, what your group said Mr. Scott should do next. And if your group kind of wasn't able to come to a consensus on this, then you can respond just as yourself here. You can respond individually. But take a look at the poll everywhere again. And Ben or Erica, can you drop the link to the poll everywhere again? Here are the responses that we laid out during the discussion. Which one did your group say? And if you put other, thanks Erica, just drop that link. If you put other and want to put in a kind of a summary of what you said for that other into the chat box, that would be helpful. So we've got a lot of people saying to review the norms as a part of this. A fair amount asking Kara to expand. A bunch in the other. So again, if you put other, would you type into the chat box what you and your group were thinking? Or if you'd like to come off of mute to explain what you were thinking.
I'll explain further, at least.
Great, thanks, Bud.
We had talked about just allowing the conversation to continue, challenging students to cite sources and fully expound on the situation. But we also felt it was important at the end of the discussion to give opportunity for students to talk about how they felt about personally, if they wanted to share anything. And we felt that that was important. So not doing it right in the middle to maybe necessarily interfere with the conversation, but maybe as a way to wrap up at the end.
Yeah, thank you. I think you highlight the importance of debriefing these types of conversations. That you know, one of the things we talk about when we do professional development with teachers around these types of conversations is, imagine that the bell's about to ring and the conversation's still going. How would you feel if, you know, kids just got up and ran out of the room in the middle of this conversation? So debrief is definitely an important part of this, talking about how you feel, how the process went, what could go differently next time. Let's see, some folks don't want to choose just one. A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Let's get one more audio response from someone. What, even if you didn't choose other, though if you did choose other, that's great. We'd love to hear from you. But why did your group choose the next step that you chose?
I think for our group, we lean towards norms because we all recognize that a harm was about to be committed in that conversation. But for me, I thought it was important to surface those perspectives and to acknowledge that this seemed to be a charged moment. Can you both explain a little bit more about what you're thinking, and that maybe this should not have been a small group discussion? Because if we look at the lived experiences of all the students in the room, he seemed to be aware that there were different lived experiences, but why have them separate out in the small groups of that conversation without maybe a more knowledgeable facilitative presence?
Yeah, those are some great points.
I'll just add in that another group that I was in also was questioning whether this should be a small group discussion. I'll just add that.
Yeah, so you know, as teachers, we make choices, right? Paula brought that up earlier. And so the choice to make this a small group discussion, it didn't have to be that choice. And so thinking about what could happen during small group discussions, and kind of balancing that. So there again are two values. Like, I value students being able to talk to one another about these experiences, and maybe that small group allows them to feel safe. But then I also value that I play a role as a facilitator of ensuring that students are affirmed, that norms are followed, and it's hard to do that when I make small group discussions. So let's move to part 2 of this scenario. Yeah, Clay brings up, I think this is a good thing to bring up, even more challenging in Zoom breakouts when the teacher is literally not present. So like, we're used to in classrooms being able to see, like, from across the room, oh, that person's body language just changed, I'm gonna go over there right now. But when we're doing this virtually, it's really, there's no body language to read. So you just kind of have to be in all these places at once. I know that one of the groups I visited was talking about how virtually do you set up these discussions, and thinking maybe more so conversations like this in breakout rooms have small groups talking about just the facts and kind of the learning, and then in whole group actually having some of these conversations. So then let's move to Ms. Lopez's dilemma in part 2 of the case study. If you will type in a response to what Ms. Lopez's dilemma is, or if anyone would like to come off of mute to share their thoughts about what one of those dilemmas is. I should amend that. There's lots of dilemmas that have surfaced.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
It's very easy for a teacher to jump in when somebody's feeling bad about another teacher not having their back, and we feel like we need to protect, and we go, you know, some people chat, you know, some people are typing in that we should talk to the other teacher and tell them how the other person feels. I always think I love self-advocacy for these kids, and I always think that they I should help them learn how to stand up for themselves and how to say how they feel. And they need to know how to take care of it by themselves. Otherwise, we're not really preparing for the real world if we keep holding them by the hand and do everything for them. Especially if you're an immigrant, or if you are Black, or if you are, an international students. We don't need people to hold our hand. We need people to teach us how to stand up ourselves and succeed in this, world that is not too kind to us, or them, for that matter.
Yeah.
It's
So
kind of like
certainly,
a lot of time when I read these answers, a lot of them is asking how can we as a teacher solve that problem for them. And I'm a strong believer, and we need to teach them how to solve their problem by themselves, and advocate for themselves and have a voice and be strong, because I think it's the best way to help them.
I think you bring up the dilemma that's at hand, or one of the dilemmas, certainly one of the main dilemmas, that building self-advocacy skills for students versus knowing that as an adult, as a colleague of Mr. Scott, if I go to Mr. Scott as his colleague, I might have a different power relationship than the student who goes to that teacher as well. So I think that that's certainly a dilemma. Rashid, if I had to guess, I could figure out which side of the dilemma that you would fall on in your decision making. But that might not be the same for all colleagues. So it's definitely something to think about. I think that is a great segue to our question about what did your group say Ms. Lopez should do. So here's the poll for that. If your group wasn't able to get to this, you can put in individually what you thought Ms. Lopez should do. And just like before, certainly if you put other, we'd love to hear what your thoughts were for that other. But even if you didn't put other, we'd love to hear why you're saying what you're saying. So you can say that in the chat box, or you can come off mute to talk about it. Christina, I know that I asked you to share what your group was talking about for this decision, if you want to come off mute to talk about that.
Sure. I think one of the things that often happens in a boarding school is when students share a common identity with a teacher, then that teacher feels like they might be a representative for that group, an advocate for that group. So I'm just feeling like Miss Lopez might have a lot of responsibility to sort of represent some of the students that share that identity with her. So just wondering if there are some allies that can be helpful to her in supporting those students.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an important thing to point out.
In our group, we talked about the ways that Ms. Lopez could ask Melanie how she could best support her, and working together in that dialogue. And then also what permission looks like here in talking with Mr. Scott or other folks around this conversation that sounds like happened in the dorm.
Can you talk more, Patrick? Well, what do you mean by what permission looks like?
Does Melanie feel comfortable with Ms. Lopez talking with Mr. Scott, with other people? A lot of the options sort of center Ms. Lopez going to other people without a conversation around how does Melanie feel about it?
Yeah, giving Melanie a voice and what happens next.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I see Anita says, suggest that Melanie talk with Mr. Scott and offer to help facilitate if Melanie chooses that. Make sure that Melanie feels that she is in control of the situation and has support. It sounds like that's a really important value here, is that students have voice, have agency, and that teachers support that, there's still students who are learning just like we all are, and so we help them with that. Any additional thoughts about this scenario or the previous scenario with Mr. Scott?
We had some difficulty with the way that Mr. Scott broke his students into groups and the assumptions he was potentially making. How does he have this information about what their backgrounds are? Or it felt, someone in our group said felt very potentially racist. And so we talked about other ways we might create those groups or have just a bigger classroom conversation or debate instead of small groups where there's potential for less supervision.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think George brings up, if I were Mr. Scott, I would want to know how a student felt about this particular moment. I think that that's another dilemma that perhaps Ms. Lopez is kind of in, is that Mr. Scott might not know how Melanie feels post-class, and Ms. Lopez is now privy to that information. And so what's my kind of responsibility? Is there a responsibility to my colleague to convey that at all? What if Melanie's decision is, I don't want to talk to Mr. Scott about this. So what does she do now? And what if Mr. Scott kind of walks back into this situation thinking this was fine, but Ms. Lopez has this information? So I guess these dilemmas never quite resolve themselves the way that we would like for them to. So I think we're about ready for Q&A time, and we have at this point about 12 minutes for that. Paula, did you want to jump in? Not 12 minutes, maybe like 15 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I have a nice little segue to what you were just saying about do you have that other slide that I
do. I have some of those slides that
are they coming up here?
Yeah, they're in there.
So, and one more, can you go to?
Yep.
So actually one more after that. So I'll just, as one way to think about, like, as you see, the dilemma sort of keeps sort of branching off and moving out. And if I move this way, now I have this set of choices before me. And the way my colleague and I are thinking about this is so we're talking about the professional long view of teaching. And I think teachers, we feel a tremendous pressure to get it right in every moment. And of course we try to do that, but I taught for 10 years. I know I did not get it right in every moment. I might have, and as many of you were saying, you know, you might think logically, yes, they should have a small group right now because this will allow more students to talk, and large group, fewer students talk. But then you might have realized, oh, that maybe wasn't the right decision after all, depending on how the groups went. So the professional long view, we talk about having 4 dimensions. So we understand that we are situated within these competing responsibilities and try to recognize the tensions when they arrive. And then I think the temporal aspect of ethics and teaching is really important, that we are with students for 180 days, depending on your school calendar. And so what happens on Tuesday, we bring that dilemma with us to Wednesday, so we can always misstep a little bit, and then, or not, if we have to give up something that we value on Tuesday, we can try to recover that value again on Wednesday. So the long view is the recognition that we're interested in the long-term development of individuals and the long-term development of our classroom community. And so we're always trying to nurture those things along the way. And the dilemmas, we're working through a whole series of dilemmas, not just one dilemma at a time. And that there was a relational aspect to teaching, and that's part of a lot of these dilemmas, and that learning to sort of communicate with each other, which you're all such a thoughtful group of teachers. It was so nice to listen to that conversation, that you're thinking about these sort of relational aspects of teaching. How are we nurturing students in their development towards self-advocacy to peers, to other adults, etc. So these are all sort of being interested in the growth of the young people we're working with, and that we're attentive to justice and fairness, which again, you guys are also talking about, like, so how we put Melanie in a bad position? Are we putting Ms. Lopez in a bad position? How else can we express allyship with our students so that everyone feels that we can sort of share sort of the relational work of teaching with each other. So I just wanted to put that out there as a way, when we think out of dilemmas, is that we're thinking sort of in the long term and not just how can I always avoid, how can I just be perfect all the time, and to say we're not going to be perfect, and we have to, it's how we respond to these moments that's really, I think, the art of teaching. So then I'll stop there, and now we can have 15 minutes of questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For you, Paula, and it's a genuine question. When Kara said immigration is out of control and we need to put an educational limit, and whatever she insinuated or meant by that, we're having all these discussions together of how to have a conversation and making sure Kara doesn't withdraw from the conversation, you know, because her, you know, her opinion matters, and it is her opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what if she rephrased it differently? What if she told Melanie that your parents are murderers and drug addicts and are very uneducated, and we need to build walls to keep you people out of here?
Mm-hmm.
Are we worried about Kara's opinion at that point? Because what she said to her when she said it's out of control, it's kind of implying the other extreme.
Yeah, so.
At one point, it is more important to worry about how Melanie feels and the hurt that was just inflicted on her and probably being inflicted on her all her life, versus worrying about somebody's, let's not offend you, you poor thing, we don't want Kara to feel bad.
Right, so you're bringing, I mean, I'm happy to turn that to the group as well, and I don't, you know, so I think that's an interesting point. And so what I'm hearing you say is that is the statement that immigration is out of control inherently a norm violation? Did she actually violate a norm, or is it that she's about to violate a norm, or is it there's a microaggression in there that needs to be kind of be addressed? And you juxtapose that with, you know, some comment about immigration that was just clearly above, or clearly a line crossing. So you can bracket the we need to build walls because immigrants are all murderers, and say, okay, that's dehumanizing language that we're gonna, like, we can just interrupt that. Like that, I don't think we should be worried as teachers to regulate the space so that there's like basic respect happening. But then this immigration is out of control is just like right in this gray area to me of, do you, like, how do you, you know, Melanie, or yeah, Melanie's going to hear that as a microaggression. Kara might think of it as, oh, I'm just like, that's just like my knee-jerk response to some of the data that was in the materials provided, you know, and so you have to, so this, you know, questioning to expand, where do you see that, what do you mean, might be an appropriate response depending on what we know about Kara, what we know, the materials that were provided, etc. But I'm happy to hear other people respond to that. I think that's a really important question. Is some comments are just so gray, you know, it's like the really bad ones are easy to deal with. It's these right on the line ones that become harder.
I have a question for you, Dr. McAvoy. So one thing that was concerning me is, this is clearly a student of color and a white student. Students of color are often told to advocate for themselves, but we as adults know that self-advocacy is a skill we're constantly developing as we grow, even in our difficult minefield of adult relationships and power dynamics. Mm-hmm. So is it realistic to ask Melanie to go to her teacher and tell him, you committed significant harm against me, one that made me think about it all day long? Mm-hmm. I had to go to another adult to negotiate.
Well, what I heard your colleagues saying, and again, they can, is that there was a lot of concern that we don't do something that Melanie doesn't want to happen. So to suggest, would you, you know, one option before you is to go and talk to Mr. Scott and tell him how you're feeling. And so that would depend a lot on, do we trust that Mr. Scott can listen non-defensively to that? Do we see Mr. Scott as someone open to that sort of interaction? But what a lot of you all were saying was it should be what Melanie wants to do. And so if Melanie's like, I don't feel comfortable doing that at all, then we certainly would never push her to do that. I would think, and the invitation, I could do that for you. Again, what I heard people saying was that she should be able to veto that and say, no, I don't feel comfortable with that either. And then a general call that in general, we want kids to advocate when they can or feel it's appropriate. Does that sound right to you? And you can feel free to disagree with me, John.
It does. I just want to make sure that we develop space for advocacy. Because I'll be blunt, if I think about a white student and the privilege they have to complain, it automatically gets accelerated. And usually people step in, whereas we often tell students of color to advocate and we don't circle back. So my concern is that student doesn't feel taken care of, because I'll just speak as a Black man. One thing our parents don't tell us is that we're always going to be safe. And that's not something that my mother ever would have told me.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that as a student, like she said, I don't want to know that an adult doesn't have my back. He doesn't have to agree with me, but he can privilege my place in the classroom as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right, but I think you're also bringing, which was I in that one image where I sort of laid on polarization and racism, sexism, so that to be attentive, I think some teachers, not sound like you, want to sort of look at the end, like, I know who I am and I think I know who you are, and this is between the two of us, and not look at the layers that are sort of sitting on top of that situation, and sort of be able to step back and go, okay, how might she be feeling about me right now as a white woman, or et cetera, or the, or the gender dynamic or whatever it is. So there's all these layers that sort of permeate, and it takes, it takes, I think, sort of the habits of mind created in teachers and faculty and staff to sort of be thinking on those levels. And it's hard. And we, as I said, I think we mess up a lot. And, and I think the non-defensiveness, like being able to be like, okay, I'm a learner too, and figure out how to navigate these situations. Yeah, I think that's important. Thank you.
So I want to get to one of the questions from the poll. It's the poll everywhere is collecting questions that people submit, and then they're getting upvoted. So our most upvoted question right now is, do you think that it is important to engage students in political discourse in classes where that's not the main focus? What level of dialogue should I promote or discourage?
I think there's so my answer is that I think there's opportunities, especially around elections, or major events like the racial protests that are happening around the country, that there are opportunities to sort of connect these things into a lot of classrooms, into the books we assign in the literature class, into, the coronavirus has all these, it has many political implications and would be appropriate for the science classroom. And so I think controversy or open, questions of open interpretation, or questions of how we live together, how should we live together questions, as we like to call them. I think there's lots of room in classes to do that, in many classes. And my research and my experience shows that students love when we bring out the controversies and allow room for, let's think about this from many perspectives. So that's sort of my personal response to that, is I think we're preparing young people for a very complicated political world, and it requires a lot of disciplinary knowledge from a lot of disciplines. So the extent that we can sort of build on that and include it, I'm all for it. But I should say that I recognize that having these sort of conversations are hard, and there are training, professional development is needed in the how, and street law is certainly one organization that does a lot of work in the how to structure the discussion. And I might add here to notice how they've set this up for today, a room of 100 or so people, that there was a lot of structure to this discussion. There was a lot of opportunity to they're trying to engage full participation through the polling, through the chat room, but that there was a lot of structure and a thought went into the structure of putting you into small groups, from the creation of the case, which is a common material to point to having options that helps people move through discussion. So there's an art to doing the structure. And so I'm a big proponent in that we need to really be careful. We need to think a lot about what questions are we asking, what questions are we treating as open, and then how are we structuring the discussion? Because we need that sort of structure. Everyone needs that sort of structure to sort of equalize the discussion and promote full participation.
Great. So the next question in the lineup for upvoting is, as teachers, we are always using language in these situations around solving or fixing the quote unquote problem. How can we move past that wanting to fix things and use these situations to create more cross-cultural dialogue instead of trying to fix the issues?
I'm tripped up by the word fix. So it is, or these situations. So one thing I'm reading in this question, and if someone wants to sort of unmute and say, do you mean fix the problem of the way we're handling discussion in the classroom, or fix?
Yeah, I think that, I think we try to we want to make it better, solve it so no one's uncomfortable in the classroom, everyone's happy again and leaves on their way. And we use language around solving and fixing all the time, when I think it's just, how can we create or empower teachers to engage in these conversations more and have a cross-cultural dialogue more? Yeah.
So great, thank you for clarifying. I agree with you 100% that our goal, or that the expectation that no emotional charged moments will happen in my classroom when I bring in these sorts of issues. That's an unreasonable expectation. That what our best thing that we can do is to be ready to respond to them and to think in advance, how do I try to make these things go as fairly as possible? And so one part of your question was that I think there's an important distinction to make between dialogues and deliberations. And dialogue, to me, the purpose of a dialogue is to have opportunities to share just how we experience the world, what I have experienced in this school, what I experience in the world day to day, and just be heard and understood and sort of affirmed. So that's dialogue. And that we're learning to sort of recognize each other as having differences of experiences. And then deliberation are these political discussions, like, should we change our gun control policy? So a deliberation is a what should the policy be question, and a dialogue is who are we sorts of questions, and how do we differently experience the world. Both of those belong in the classroom, but we need clarity of when we're doing one or the other. And so I think that just sort of putting that distinction in our minds is helpful. And then they both go better when you've had opportunities to do both. And so we actually started today with the question of how do I feel about political discussions? And so that's sort of putting your sort of emotional self first, or your vulnerable, your human self first, before we go into, well, what should Mr. Scott do?
So unfortunately, that's the time that we have for questions, but I have captured several of the questions that people have asked, and we'll collect those questions and see if we can put some short responses to some of those questions we didn't get to in an email to be able to follow up, because there were some really great questions about kind of practical things that we weren't able to answer. So I'll be in touch with Clay, and hopefully he can share some of those thoughts out with you all. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. McAvoy, for all those answers, and thank you all for participating today.
We know that these are challenging conversations and the dilemmas exist, but we hope that you found this informative and thought-provoking. These are our objectives for today. We like to check back and make sure we did what we said we were going to do. So early in the seminar, we talked about why we should engage in these conversations, but also the dilemmas that exist. During our case study work, we applied some of the research and the readings to an actual dilemma. And then through our Q&A and our conversations, we weighed those strategies and thought about how to support students as they engage in these conversations. So for next steps, we have some resources that you might want to explore in more depth. So the last 2 pages of your handouts is an annotated list of resources with lots of topics that are related to today, going in different directions. Street Law also has we have our own very discussion protocol that is very formal and structured that you can use with students, and we call those deliberations, and you can find them at all the information about how to do them and lots of prepared deliberations at the link there that has also been dropped in the chat box. Also, if you have a moment, if you could fill out the evaluation of today's PD, we would very much appreciate it. So you can just hold your camera up to the QR code. You don't even need a reader, and it will just open it. Also, Clay will send a follow-up email that has a link to that evaluation. It will be open for a week, and we'd really appreciate your feedback if you have time. Thank you. So these are our emails. Please feel free to email us with questions, and then I'll throw it over to Jen and Clay.
Yeah, so I think we're gonna have Clay do a quick wrap up, but I just also want to say thank you all so much for your time today and your engagement and thoughtful questions and responses.
All right, just a quick thank you to Dr. McAvoy and to Jen and your team. I know this has been a long process in trying to get this together on behalf of our community, and I really appreciate the flexibility and your professionalism and working through that. So on behalf of the school, thanks for being here. Whatever we can do for Zoom for applause and the reactions, let's use those if you feel like it's appropriate for you. And next steps is we're going to keep the conversations going, and those kinds of controversial conversations I think are needed in an adult community as well, to talk about how we do this stuff, because it's not easy, and we have to be comfortable and trusting with one another to do the best we can with each other. So Jen, thanks so much for your work and the structure for today and getting us together, and I appreciate it. And we will see everybody for our meetings that continue at 1 o'clock on campus. Again, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.